He wasn't supposed to come back. The coffin rested at the center of Arlington's quiet hillside, wrapped in a flag that moved just slightly with the morning wind, as if even the fabric hesitated to lie still. The sky hung low and gray, the kind of sky that pressed gently on your chest without asking permission, and the rows of white headstones stretched out like silent witnesses, each one holding a story that ended too soon. Captain Lucas Bennett's name had already been spoken in past tense, already folded into memory, already placed somewhere between honor and absence. Around the coffin, Marines stood in perfect formation, their dress blues sharp, their faces composed in that practiced stillness that comes from knowing grief has rules here. Boots aligned, shoulders squared, eyes forward. No one moved more than necessary. No one spoke louder than a breath. But just beyond the line, held by a single handler gripping a worn leather leash, stood Shadow. A German shepherd with a sable coat darkened by years of service, his fur catching the dim light in shades of black and ash, his amber eyes fixed, not on the coffin, not on the flag, but somewhere just beyond it. He didn't bark. Not yet. His body trembled, barely noticeable, a vibration that ran beneath his skin like something trying to surface. The handler, a young corporal with hands too tight on the leash, leaned down slightly. "Easy, boy," he whispered, though his own voice carried the weight of something he didn't understand. Shadow didn't respond. His ears flicked once, then again, listening, not to the chaplain's quiet voice as it began to speak words about sacrifice and service and a life well lived, but to something else, something thinner, something wrong. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of polished wood, damp earth, and distant rain, but Shadow's nose twitched as if catching a thread hidden beneath it all, something out of place in a moment meant to be final. He took one step forward. The leash tightened. The corporal stiffened. "Hold." Someone murmured from the line. Not harsh, just enough to remind that this was not the place for movement, not the place for disruption. Shadow froze, but only for a second. His gaze moved, slowly, deliberately, sliding past the coffin, past the flag, and landing on a man standing 3 rows back. A man in uniform. A man who stood too still, even for this place. His posture was correct, but not natural. His eyes didn't lower when others did. He wasn't grieving. He was watching. Shadow's lips parted slightly, not in a snarl, not in fear, but in recognition that had no name. A low sound began deep in his chest. Not a bark, not yet, just a vibration, like a warning whispered beneath breath. The handler felt it through the leash. "What is it?" he muttered, more to himself than the dog. The chaplain's voice continued, steady, unwavering, speaking of courage and duty, of a man who had led from the front and never left anyone behind. The words drifted across the field, settling gently over the crowd like dust. But Shadow didn't hear them, because somewhere beneath the silence, beneath the ceremony, beneath the idea that this moment was over, something wasn't resting. Something wasn't finished. The dog's body leaned forward again, more insistent this time, his paws pressing into the damp grass, as if the ground itself held answers he needed to uncover. His eyes never left that man, and for the first time, the handler noticed it too. "Why are you looking there?" he whispered. Shadow didn't answer. He couldn't, but his tail went rigid. His ears locked forward, and that low sound in his chest grew just a little louder. Not grief, not confusion, something closer to truth trying to break through a lie. The wind picked up again, brushing against the flag, lifting one corner just enough to reveal the polished edge of the coffin beneath. And for a single, fleeting second, Shadow shifted his gaze back to it, just long enough to confirm what his instincts had already decided. Then he looked back at the man. And this time, he didn't tremble. He chose. The first time Shadow met Lucas Bennett, the air smelled like dust and sunburned metal, the kind of dry heat that clung to your skin and refused to let go even after sunset. And the training yard at Camp Pendleton shimmered under a California sun that showed no mercy to men or dogs still learning each other. Lucas stood with his sleeves rolled just above the wrist, his posture relaxed in a way that only came from years of discipline, watching as the young German shepherd paced in tight circles at the end of a short lead, ears sharp, eyes restless, unsure whether to trust or resist. "That is Shadow," the trainer had said, voice calm but edged with caution. "High drive, high intelligence, does not respond well to uncertainty. He needs a handler who does not hesitate. Lucas did not step forward right away. He studied the dog instead, the way his paws hit the ground, the way his gaze never stayed in one place for long, always scanning, always calculating. Not fear, not aggression, just a mind that refused to be idle. He is not looking for commands, Lucas said quietly. He is looking for someone worth listening to. The trainer gave a short nod. Then do not waste his time. When Lucas finally approached, he did not reach out. He did not speak. He simply walked into Shadow's space and stopped, close enough to be noticed, far enough to leave a choice. The dog froze. The pacing stopped. The air shifted. For a long second, neither moved. Then Shadow stepped forward, slow, deliberate, nose lifting toward Lucas's hand, catching the scent of leather gloves, gun oil, and something steadier beneath it all. No flinch, no pullback, just quiet. Lucas exhaled, barely audible. There you are, he murmured, more to the moment than the dog. That was the beginning. Not a command, not a trick, a decision. Weeks turned into months measured in early mornings and long runs, in silent drills where words were unnecessary and trust was built in inches, not leaps. Shadow learned the rhythm of Lucas's steps, the subtle shift in his breathing that meant move, the stillness that meant wait. Lucas learned the language of ears and tail, the difference between curiosity and warning, the quiet signals that never made it into manuals but saved lives all the same. They did not rush each other. They did not need to. By the time they deployed, the bond was no longer something they practiced. It was something they carried. Out there, where the horizon blurred into heat waves and the air held. The scent of sand and something older, something worn down by years of conflict. Shadow moved ahead of Lucas with a purpose that felt almost like certainty. Not reckless. Never reckless. Just sure. There were moments when the world narrowed to a single step, a single breath, a single choice that could not be taken back. And in those moments, Lucas did not look at maps or orders. He looked at Shadow. You see it before I do not you? He would say under his breath, a faint smile touching the edge of something heavier. Shadow never answered. He did not need to. He would pause, just long enough, just enough to shift the path by a few inches, and those inches would matter more than anyone else could see. Nights were different. Quieter, but not peaceful. The sky stretched wide and endless, stars scattered like distant signals, and the cold crept in slow, settling into bones that had carried too much for too long. Lucas would sit with his back against rough concrete or the side of a vehicle, Shadow pressed close beside him, a steady weight that grounded everything else. No commands, no expectations, just presence. We make it back, Lucas said once, voice low, almost swallowed by the wind. That is the deal. Shadow's ears flicked, catching the tone more than the words, and he shifted closer, resting his head briefly against Lucas's knee, a gesture so small it could have been missed by anyone not looking for it. But Lucas noticed. He always did. And in that quiet exchange, something unspoken settled between them. Not hope, something stronger. A promise that did not ask for certainty, only commitment. Back at the ceremony, as the memory lingered like a distant echo, Shadow's gaze remained locked on the man who did not belong to grief, and somewhere deep within that trained, disciplined mind, the same certainty began to rise again, the same quiet knowing that had once guided them through places where hesitation cost too much, and now, standing in a place meant for endings, Shadow felt it clearly. This was not the end. Not yet. The day everything changed did not begin with chaos or noise, but with a stillness so complete it almost felt like the world was holding its breath. The kind of morning where even the wind moved carefully across the dry hills, carrying dust in slow drifting lines that blurred the horizon into something uncertain and far away. Lucas walked ahead, boots pressing firm into the packed earth, each step measured, each movement deliberate, while Shadow moved just slightly in front of him, low and focused, his body aligned with a purpose that had been refined through countless hours of trust built without words. There were no alarms, no raised voices, no visible threat that would make an untrained eye hesitate. But something beneath the surface was wrong, something quiet and subtle, the kind of wrong that could only be felt by those who had learned to listen to what was not being said. Shadow slowed. It was not sudden. It was not dramatic. Just a fraction of a second where his stride shortened, and his head angled slightly to the left, ears tightening, catching something carried in the air that did not belong. Lucas noticed immediately. He always did. "What is it?" he murmured under his breath, not expecting an answer, only acknowledging the shift. Shadow did not move forward. Instead, he stood still, nose lifting, drawing in the scent again, deeper this time, sorting through layers of dust, metal, fabric, and something faint that lingered just out of reach like a memory that refused to fully form. The team behind them paused, waiting for instruction, eyes on Lucas, trusting his next move without question. He raised a hand, signaling a halt. No urgency, no panic, just stillness, the kind that keeps you alive. Seconds passed, long enough to matter. Then Lucas stepped slightly to the right, changing their path by less than a foot, a small adjustment that looked insignificant to anyone else, but meant everything in that moment. Shadow moved with him instantly, tension easing just enough to allow motion again, but not enough to relax completely. They continued, careful, deliberate, each step chosen instead of assumed. It was only later, after the area had been cleared, after the report had been written in the language of procedure and probability, that the weight of that moment settled into something heavier. "You stopped before I saw anything," Lucas said quietly that night, sitting against the side of their vehicle, the metal still warm from the day's heat. Shadow lay beside him, alert even in rest, eyes reflecting the dim light like small, steady flames. "You always do," Lucas added, almost to himself. The dog shifted slightly, pressing closer, not seeking praise, not needing acknowledgement, just maintaining the presence that had become as essential as breath. That was how it worked between them. No questions, no doubt, just trust that ran deeper than explanation. But not every moment came with clarity. Not every signal arrived in time to be understood. There was one day, later, when the air felt different in a way Lucas could not immediately name, a tension that sat just beneath the routine, subtle but persistent, like a thread pulled too tight. Shadow reacted before anything else changed. His posture stiffened, not toward the open terrain ahead, but toward someone behind them, someone within the team. It was brief, easy to miss. A glance held half a second too long. A low sound that never fully formed into a growl. Lucas turned slightly, following the line of Shadow's attention, but saw nothing that justified concern, only familiar faces, familiar uniforms, men who had stood beside them for weeks. "Stand down," he said softly, placing a hand near Shadow's shoulder, not to restrain, but to steady. The dog obeyed. He always did. But the tension did not leave completely. It settled instead, quiet and waiting. Lucas exhaled slowly, pushing the feeling aside, trusting what he could see over what he could not yet understand. It was a choice, one he would carry with him long after that day ended. Back at the ceremony, the memory flickered through Shadow's mind not as images, but as sensations, fragments of scent and sound that refused to align with the story being told around him now. The same wrongness, the same quiet signal beneath the surface, and the same man standing too still, too composed, as if he had already decided how this moment should unfold. Shadow's body leaned forward again, more certain this time, the hesitation gone, replaced by something sharper, something that did not ask permission to be understood. Because before, in a place far from here, he had felt this once already. And last time, it had been ignored. The moment Lucas chose to trust what he could see instead of what Shadow felt did not arrive like a mistake. It arrived quietly, wrapped in routine, disguised as discipline, the kind of decision that feels reasonable until time reveals the cost hidden beneath it. The mission that followed seemed ordinary on the surface, another sweep, another stretch of land that needed to be checked and cleared, another set of coordinates that meant more to a map than to the men walking through it. The sun was lower that day, casting long shadows across the uneven ground, turning every ridge and dip into something that could hide more than it showed. Shadow moved ahead as always, precise, controlled, his body aligned with the rhythm he had built beside Lucas over months that had taught them both how to move without wasting a single step. But the tension from before had not left him. It lingered in the way his ears remained slightly back, in the way his head turned more often than usual, checking not only the path ahead but the space behind them. Lucas noticed. He always noticed. But this time, he held on to the memory of nothing being there, of seeing only familiar faces, of choosing to believe that instinct had been mistaken. "Stay on path," he said quietly, more a reassurance to himself than a correction to the dog. Shadow obeyed, because obedience was part of who he was. But something in his movement had changed, something that no command could fully erase. They reached the structure just before dusk, an abandoned building worn down by time, its walls marked by wind and heat, its windows empty like eyes that had stopped watching long ago. The team spread out, controlled, methodical, each man taking position as trained, each step calculated, each breath measured. It was the kind of operation that depended on trust, not just in training, but in each other. Shadow hesitated again. This time it was sharper, clearer. He stopped completely, body rigid, gaze not fixed on the building, but again on someone within their own line. The same direction, the same silent warning. Lucas felt it before he understood it, that subtle shift that meant something was wrong. But the structure ahead demanded attention, demanded action, demanded focus that did not allow for doubt to spread. "We clear it," Lucas said, voice steady, controlled, pushing the hesitation aside. Orders moved forward. The team advanced. Shadow followed. Because that was what he had been trained to do, what he had chosen to do from the very first moment he stepped toward Lucas instead of away. But as they crossed the threshold, something in the air changed, not loud, not visible, just a break in the pattern, a disruption so small it could be missed by anyone not already searching for it. Shadow reacted instantly, turning his head back, not forward, a low sound rising in his chest, stronger now, no longer hidden, no longer uncertain. Lucas turned too, following the motion, and for a brief second, everything aligned, the memory, the tension, the unease that had been building without a name. But it was a second too late to understand fully, a second too late to change what had already been set into motion. The world did not explode into chaos. It shifted. It fractured. Communication broke into fragments, voices overlapping, movement losing its clean precision, the kind of disruption that does not need volume to carry weight. In the confusion, Shadow stayed locked on Lucas, refusing to move away, refusing to lose him in the noise that had replaced order. "I am here," Lucas said, not loudly, not panicked, just enough for the dog to hear, grounding him in the only thing that mattered. Shadow pressed closer, body aligned with his, every instinct focused on keeping that connection intact no matter what else changed around them. And then, just as quickly as it had broken, the moment passed, leaving behind something quieter but far heavier, a silence that carried questions no one could answer in that instant. Later, the reports would speak of miscommunication, of timing, of conditions that made clarity difficult, words that explained without truly explaining. But Shadow did not understand reports. He understood patterns. And one pattern had been broken. Back at the ceremony, as the chaplain's voice faded into the background and the wind moved softly across the field, Shadow's certainty hardened into something unshakable, because the feeling he carried now was the same one he had felt then, the same quiet warning that had been set aside, the same presence that did not belong to truth. And this time, he would not ignore it. The sound that finally broke the silence was not loud, not sharp, but unmistakable, a low, steady bark that rolled out of Shadow's chest like something pulled from deep within him, something that had waited long enough and refused to stay hidden any longer. Heads turned, not all at once, but enough to ripple through the formation, subtle shifts in posture, brief glances that broke the strict stillness expected in a place like this. The handler tightened his grip on the leash instinctively. "Shadow," he whispered, a quiet warning, but the dog did not respond. His eyes were locked forward, not on the coffin, not on the flag, but on that same man standing 3 rows back, the one who did not lower his gaze, the one whose stillness felt practiced instead of natural. Another bark came, sharper this time, cutting through the air and settling into the space between discipline and disruption. The chaplain paused, just for a fraction of a second, before continuing, but the rhythm had already been broken. Shadow stepped forward. The leash pulled tight. The handler planted his feet, struggling to hold him in place. "Easy," he said again, but there was uncertainty in his voice now, a hesitation that had not been there before. Because this was not grief. This was something else, something intentional. Shadow's body leaned into the restraint, muscles tense but controlled, every movement directed, not wild, not confused. He was not reacting. He was choosing. The man in the third row shifted slightly, just enough to be noticed if someone had been watching closely, just enough to break the perfect stillness he had held until now. His eyes flicked toward the dog for a brief second, then away, as if dismissing it, as if refusing to acknowledge what stood in front of him. But Shadow had already seen enough. The scent was there, faint, buried beneath layers of uniform fabric and clean air, but unmistakable to him. The same trace from before, the same wrongness that had followed them across miles and moments, that had whispered in places where no one else had listened. Shadow pulled harder. The handler lost half a step, boots sliding slightly on the damp grass. "Hold him," someone murmured from the side, low and controlled, but the tension was spreading now, threading through the ceremony in ways that could not be undone. Shadow let out another bark, deeper, more insistent, then lowered his body slightly, not in aggression, but in focus, the kind of posture that meant he had made a decision and would not be turned away from it. The man in the third row took a step back. Small, careful, but it was enough. Enough for others to notice. Enough for the pattern to shift. A senior officer near the front turned his head, eyes narrowing slightly as he followed the line of Shadow's gaze, then moved it back to the man, measuring, assessing, not yet acting but no longer ignoring. "What is going on?" he asked quietly, more to the moment than to anyone specific. The handler did not answer. He could not. Because whatever this was, it was no longer something he could control with a leash and a command. Shadow surged forward again, and this time, the handler's grip slipped just enough for the distance between them to close by a few inches. Not free, not yet, but closer. The dog's breath came steady, controlled, his eyes never leaving the man who now stood no longer as still as before, his composure beginning to crack at the edges in ways that only someone watching closely would see. The wind moved again, lifting the edge of the flag slightly, brushing across the polished surface beneath, and for a brief moment, the reflection caught the scene in fragments, a dog pulling forward, a man stepping back, a line of Marines shifting ever so slightly out of perfect alignment. Something was breaking. Not loudly, not completely, but enough. Shadow let out one final bark, sharp and undeniable, then stilled, not because he was done, but because he was certain. And certainty, once it arrives, does not need to shout. The air shifted in a way that no command could restore, a subtle fracture running through the ceremony like a crack beneath glass, invisible at first, but impossible to ignore once it began to spread, and the officer at the front took a single step forward, not rushed, not alarmed, but deliberate, his gaze now fixed on the man who had moved when no one else had. The man whose stillness had broken just enough to betray something beneath it. "Sergeant," the officer said quietly, his voice calm but carrying authority that did not need volume. "Hold position." It was not a question. It was not a suggestion. The man stiffened, his posture correcting instantly, shoulders squared, chin level, every movement precise, almost too precise, as if he were performing the role instead of simply standing within it. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice steady, but there was a thin edge beneath it now, something tight, something controlled. Shadow did not look away. He had already made his choice, and now he stood completely still, the leash slack for the first time, not because he had given up, but because he no longer needed to pull. The handler felt it, the sudden absence of tension, and for a moment, that stillness felt heavier than the struggle before it. "What is he reacting to?" the officer asked, not taking his eyes off the man. The handler hesitated, searching for an answer that made sense within the boundaries of protocol, but nothing came. "Sir, he has never acted like this without cause." The words hung in the air, simple, unembellished, but carrying weight that could not be dismissed. The officer nodded once, slow, acknowledging what had been said without fully accepting it yet. His gaze shifted briefly to the coffin, then back to the man. "Step forward," he said. The command was clear. The man hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Enough. Enough for those watching to feel it, even if they could not name it. Then he complied, taking one measured step out of line, boots pressing into the grass with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet that followed. Shadow's ears locked forward. His body leaned slightly, not in aggression, but in focus, tracking every movement with the same precision he had once used in places where mistakes cost more than anyone here wanted to remember. The officer stepped closer, closing the distance between them, his expression unchanged, his voice still controlled. "Name and assignment," he said. The man answered without delay this time. The words correct, the tone disciplined, everything in place exactly as it should be. And yet, something remained off, something that could not be measured in words or posture. Shadow took a single step forward. No pull, no resistance, just movement. The handler did not stop him. Not this time. Because whatever was happening now had moved beyond commands and corrections into something else entirely, something that demanded to be seen through, not silenced. The officer's gaze flickered briefly to the dog, then back to the man, as if weighing two different kinds of evidence, one spoken, one instinctive, and deciding which one to trust. The wind passed again, light but steady, carrying with it the faint scent that only one among them could truly understand. Shadow's nose lifted slightly, confirming what had already settled into certainty. The same trace, the same hidden thread that did not belong in this place of endings. The officer's voice lowered just enough to shift the tone of the moment. "Remove your cover," he said. It was a small request. Routine. Harmless. The kind of instruction that should not carry consequence. The man paused. Again, longer this time. Then slowly, deliberately, he reached up and removed his cap, revealing nothing unusual, nothing immediately out of place. And yet the hesitation lingered in the air, unanswered. Shadow moved closer. Another step, then another, until the space between them had narrowed to something that no longer allowed distance to hide what could not be seen from afar. The dog stopped, stared, and in that stillness, the entire field seemed to wait, breath held, sound suspended, as if even the wind understood that whatever came next would not belong to ceremony, but to truth. The silence stretched longer than it should have, long enough for doubt to begin pressing at the edges of discipline, long enough for every man standing in formation to feel that something unseen had already shifted the course of what this moment was meant to be, and Shadow did not move because he did not need to. His certainty now complete, his focus narrowed to a single point that no longer allowed distraction or hesitation. The officer studied the man in front of him, not with suspicion alone, but with the practiced awareness of someone who had learned to read what others tried to conceal, and for a brief second, his gaze flickered toward the coffin again, as if weighing two realities at once, one declared, one unfolding. "Stand easy," he said, though the words carried no ease within them. Only control, only the effort to keep the moment contained before it could fracture further. The man nodded, but his breath had changed, subtle, uneven, the smallest shift that would go unnoticed by most, but not by Shadow. Never by Shadow. The dog took one final step forward, closing the distance completely, his head lifting slightly as he drew in the air around the man, confirming what had already been written into instinct, what had already been proven once before in a place far from here, where hesitation had cost too much. A low sound built again in his chest, but this time it did not rise into a bark. It stayed contained, controlled, a signal meant not for alarm, but for clarity. The officer noticed. He always would. "Hold," he said softly, but the command was no longer directed at the dog. It was directed at the moment itself, at the unfolding tension that now demanded resolution. He turned slightly, addressing another Marine at his side. "Open it." The words landed heavier than anything spoken before. Not loud, not dramatic, but final. A shift moved through the formation, controlled but undeniable, as two Marines stepped forward toward the coffin, their movements precise, deliberate, carrying out an order that should have belonged to ceremony, not suspicion. The flag was lifted carefully, folded back just enough to reveal the polished surface beneath, reflecting the gray sky in a dull, muted sheen. No one spoke. No one moved beyond what was required. The latches were touched, one by one, each click quiet but amplified in the stillness, each sound marking the crossing of a line that could not be uncrossed. Shadow did not look at the man anymore. He turned, slowly, deliberately, his gaze settling on the coffin as if everything had been leading to this single point. The wind stilled. Even the distant sounds of the bass seemed to fall away, leaving only the soft movement of fabric and the faint rhythm of breath shared by those who waited without knowing what they were waiting for. The lid began to rise. Not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to break the seal that had been accepted as final. And in that small, controlled motion, the world seemed to pause, suspended between what had been believed and what was about to be revealed. Shadow stepped closer, his body aligned with the opening, his ears forward, his breath steady, no longer searching, no longer questioning. Because whatever lay inside, he already knew it did not belong to death. The lid lifted higher, inch by inch, revealing darkness at first, then shape, then something that shifted ever so slightly, so faint it could have been missed by anyone who was not already looking for it. A hand, not still, not lifeless, moving, just enough, just once. And in that moment, the silence did not break into chaos or noise. It deepened, it widened, it held, because what they were witnessing did not demand reaction. It demanded understanding. Shadow exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his body not in relief, but in recognition, the kind that comes when truth finally aligns with what has been felt all along. And behind him, somewhere in that fractured formation, a man who had stood too still began, at last, to move. For a moment, no one moved, not even the wind, as if the world itself needed time to understand what had just been revealed, and Shadow stood at the edge of the coffin, his body still but his presence unmistakable, his eyes fixed on the figure inside with a calm that did not belong to shock, only to recognition. Captain Lucas Bennett lay there, pale but present, his chest rising faintly beneath the uniform that had already been folded into memory, his hand twitching again, small and slow, like someone reaching back from a place that had almost taken him. A breath escaped him, shallow, uneven, but real. Completely real. The officer stepped forward instantly, not in panic, but in controlled urgency, his voice low but firm. Medic. The word carried across the field without breaking its silence, a command wrapped in restraint. Two Marines moved without hesitation, kneeling beside the coffin, checking, confirming, their hands steady even as their eyes betrayed the weight of what they were witnessing. He is alive, one of them said quietly, as if saying it louder might shatter the moment. Around them, the formation had broken, not into chaos, but into something softer, something uncertain, as men who had come to honor an ending now stood at the edge of something entirely different. Shadow moved then, not quickly, not wildly, but with a purpose that had no hesitation left in it. He stepped closer, placing his front paws gently against the edge, leaning just enough to bring himself within reach, his nose lowering toward Lucas's hand. For a second, nothing happened. Then the fingers moved again, slightly stronger this time, brushing against the fur at Shadow's muzzle. The contact was small, barely there, but it was enough. Shadow exhaled, a long, steady breath that seemed to release everything he had been holding since the moment this had begun, his body softening not into relief, but into something deeper, something that did not need explanation. He did not bark. He did not whine. He simply stayed, his presence anchored to the man he had never truly lost. Behind them, the man who had stood too still had begun to step away, slow at first, careful, as if hoping the shift in attention would allow him to disappear into the confusion that followed revelation. But the officer saw him. He had never stopped seeing him. Hold position, the officer said again, but this time the command carried a different weight, directed clearly, unmistakably. Another Marine stepped forward, intercepting the man before he could move further, not with force, not with urgency, but with certainty that left no room for argument. The man stopped. His composure, once so controlled, now fractured in subtle ways, his breath no longer steady, his gaze no longer fixed. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say that could restore what had already been undone. The focus returned quickly to Lucas, as it should have, as it always would have, and the medics worked with quiet precision, checking, stabilizing, preparing to move him carefully from the coffin that had been meant to close his story. "Stay with us, Captain," one of them said, voice low, steady, the kind of tone used not to command, but to guide. Lucas's eyes did not fully open, but there was awareness there, faint but unmistakable, a presence that refused to slip away. Shadow remained at his side, stepping back only when necessary, never losing that line of connection, never allowing distance to replace what had been proven once again in front of everyone who stood there. The flag rested to the side now, no longer covering, no longer marking an ending, but waiting, as if even it understood that its purpose had changed. The sky above remained gray, but lighter now, the weight of it lifting just enough to let something through, something quieter, something that did not announce itself but could be felt all the same. And in the middle of that field, where loss had been expected and finality prepared, something else had taken its place. Not a miracle shouted into the air. Something smaller, something steadier. A truth carried first by a dog who refused to accept what did not feel right, and held long enough for the world to catch up. The movement from the field to the waiting vehicle happened with a precision that felt almost sacred, every step measured, every motion deliberate, as if the space between what had nearly been lost and what had just been returned needed to be protected with care, and Shadow walked beside them without command, without leash tension, simply staying close enough to feel the rhythm of Lucas's breath as it steadied, slow but certain, like something relearning its place in the world. The sound of the ambulance doors closing did not echo like an ending. It settled quietly, like a boundary drawn between what had been believed and what had now been proven false. Inside, Lucas lay supported, monitored, guided back into a present that had almost slipped away, his eyes still closed but no longer distant, no longer unreachable. A medic spoke softly, steady words that carried no urgency, only direction, the kind of voice used to bring someone back, not pull them. Shadow remained just outside, held now only by presence, not restraint, his gaze fixed through the narrow window, tracking every subtle shift, every breath, every sign that the connection he had refused to let go was still intact. The officer stood nearby, posture unchanged, but something in his expression had softened, the edge of command replaced by something quieter, something closer to understanding. He looked once toward the man who had tried to step away, now no longer moving, no longer unnoticed, and then back to the vehicle, as if the truth of one moment had already begun to settle into the consequences of another. "You saw it before we did," he said, not loudly, not formally, but enough for the handler to hear, enough for the words to carry weight. The handler nodded slightly, his hand resting loosely against Shadow's collar, not holding, just there. "He always does," he replied. The vehicle began to move, slowly at first, then with purpose, carrying Lucas away from the place that had almost claimed him, towards something still uncertain, but no longer final. Shadow took a step forward, then stopped, watching, waiting, as if measuring the distance not in yards, but in something far more personal. The engine sound faded gradually, blending into the quiet of the field, leaving behind only the faint imprint of what had just unfolded. Around them, the formation had dissolved, not into disorder, but into something human, something that allowed breath to return, that allowed eyes to shift, that allowed the weight of what they had witnessed to settle in ways that would not be spoken aloud, but would not be forgotten. The flag was lifted again, carefully, respectfully, but not returned to the coffin. It was folded instead, held with the same care, but now without the finality it had carried before. The sky had changed almost imperceptibly, the gray lifting just enough to let a thin line of light break through, not bright, not overwhelming, just present, like a quiet answer to a question no one had dared to ask out loud. Shadow finally turned away from the path the vehicle had taken, his body relaxed now, not from exhaustion, but from completion, the kind that comes when something has been carried all the way through to its truth. He walked a few steps, then stopped again, looking back once more, not because he needed to, but because he could. Because this time, there was something to return to. The handler followed, slower, thoughtful, as if trying to understand something that could not be explained in words or reports or structured debriefs. And as they moved away from the place where loss had almost been sealed into permanence, the space they left behind did not feel empty. It felt changed. Because sometimes, what saves a life is not a command, not a plan, not even a perfect moment. Sometimes, it is a quiet refusal to accept what does not feel true. A presence that stays when everything else prepares to let go. A bond that does not wait for proof, because it already knows. And in that knowing, Two lives are carried back from the edge, not by force, not by chance, but by something smaller, steadier, and far more certain than either could ever have named.